On this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, we're going to take a look at why there are snowblowers in Miami, the nature of dysfunction that is present in most companies and organizations, and why it occurs, most importantly, what leaders at all levels can do to tackle these issues and improve performance. Welcome to Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty Leadership Interview Series. I'm your host, Dov Barron, founder of Full Monty Leadership. If you're a regular listener, big thank you to you for being part of the more than 1.5 million downloads and making us the number one podcast for Fortune 500 listeners and consistently keeping us at the top in next generation leadership, family business, human resources, and a whole bunch of other great categories. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing the show with everyone that you know. And remember, we always need your help in staying relevant. So please go to iTunes, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. My guest today is Stephen Goldstein. He helps improve companies' performance through renewed engagement and laser-like focus. He has over 30 years of experience working as an operations executive in global Fortune 500 corporations, including as the chairman and CEO of the American Express Bank. You may have heard of those, right? His talent lies in unleashing companies' hidden assets, transforming employee and customer engagement, and accelerating the pace of decision-making and change. He is a sought-after public speaker and the author of Why Are There Snowblowers in Miami? How to Transform Your Business Using 5 Principles of Engagement. Welcome, Stephen. Woo! Crowd goes wild.
Thanks, Dov. It's great to be on your show today.
It's good to have you here, mate. We're going to have some fun. So tell us, let's start off, because you and I have had a previous chat, and we had to talk about this, and I just think it's so great. Tell us why there are snowblowers in Miami, because it doesn't get a lot of snow.
Well, that's right. It doesn't get a lot of snow. And so you know that I wrote a book that's coming out shortly in a few weeks. And as I was thinking about a title for the book, I went through a normal process of looking for titles, but this title kept coming back into my head. And I realized it has to be the title. But the title, while a little crazy, actually comes from a real story. 20 years ago, I was president of the Sears credit card business based in Chicago. And it was February. It was one of these polar vortex situations. They didn't call it that then, but that's what it was. Right. And fortunately, I had to fly to Miami to give a speech to the National Retail Association in February. So I was glad to get out of Chicago. Yes. And I always had a practice that when I traveled, I wanted to visit the stores to really find out what's going on at the ground level. And so I was a little early for my speech and went into the Sears store. And I happened to walk in. The entrance was the Lawn and Garden Center. And so I went in and saw what you would expect to see: lawnmowers, patio furniture, rakes and shovels, barbecue grills, and all that, patio furniture.
And again, this is February in Miami.
Yeah, but it's warm there, so you expect to see all that stuff.
Of course.
And out of the corner of my eye, I see 4 snowblowers. And it was sort of an out-of-the-body experience, and I felt my body like just walking over there by itself. And sure enough, there were 4 snowblowers there. And there was an elderly salesman whose badge said Pete on it, his name. And I said, Pete, why are there it just came out of my mouth. Why are there snowblowers in Miami? And he said, and I introduced myself, I told him who I was, and he said, you don't know the half of it. And I said, I don't know anything. And basically he proceeded to tell me a story that every September they would get 4 or 5 snowblowers in cartons. They'd put them out on the floor. And every April they'd put them back in cartons and send them back to the warehouse. And I said, well, how long has this been going on? He said, well, I've been here 30 years and it's been going on as long as I've been here. And I said, this is like incredulous, right? So I said, well, what do you do about it? And he says, well, my manager calls headquarters, the store manager calls headquarters. And I said, and what do they tell them? And he says, well, they tell them it's part of the national allocation.
National allocation.
National allocation. And I said, do you know what that means? And he said, I have no idea what that means. So I said, okay, I only have one more question to ask you. Have you ever sold a snowblower here? And he said, yes, we did sell one a few years ago. A couple was going up for Christmas to visit their kids in Minnesota, and they put one in the minivan and they drove up to Minnesota to give it to their kids. I said, "That's it?" He goes, "That's it." So I shook his hand and I left. Gave my speech. Oh, I'm giving this speech. This story's like in my head. I can't get out of my head. The next day I fly back to headquarters and we have our weekly leadership meeting. And not surprisingly, the big news was this terrible snowstorm and how it was disrupting the supply chain. And you will not be surprised to know that we were out of stock on snowblowers. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's sort of concerned about it and figuring what we can do. And I reach into my pocket and I pull out this guy's card. And I said, "Look, I was in Miami yesterday and there are 4 in the store. Here's this guy, Pete's card. Call him. At least we have 4. And they start hysterically laughing. Like, this is hysterical, right? Yeah. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" And they said, "It's funny." I said, "No, it's actually not funny. It's actually quite sad."
Deeply sad.
Deeply sad. And like most things in large companies, the meeting ends. Everybody goes back to their offices. And as I'm walking back to my office, I'm boiling, and I tell my assistant, "Stop what you're doing. I want you to call anybody you can to answer the following question. In the history of recorded weather, how many times has it snowed in Miami? Call NASA, call NUMA, call the Farmer's Almanac." She comes in 45 minutes later and she's like, "Got it. It snowed 1 time 7 years ago, 1/3 of an inch." So, exactly. So you start to think to yourself, okay, this is insane, right?
Sure.
And, you could understand how, everybody makes mistakes. So you could understand how they got there the first time. Mm-hmm. But it's incomprehensible how they went there 30 years in a row.
30 years in a row.
So to me, it was really a question of the kind of rut people get into where, problems are hiding in plain sight and you don't see them, partly because you're not looking for them.
Right.
Partly because you get numbed by seeing the same thing every day and you don't realize actually what you're seeing. And part of it is a sense of futility that even if you did something, the chances are that nothing would happen as a result.
Well, that's what you said, right? You said that Pete had said that his manager and the regional manager had all called, but it didn't make any difference.
Right. So I come in as a new person and see this craziness, and I ask the question, but everybody else who worked in that store, obviously had basically given up. They accepted the fact that this insanity is the norm. And so they move on to some other issue. And if you think about that and you multiply times all the things that go on in a company, it's pretty frightening. And that's part of the problem that exists out there. And that's part of why I wrote the book, which is really about engagement and how do you get people to not behave in such a way that you would send the same thing to the wrong place 30 years in a row. It's really a metaphor for what's wrong and how you can begin to put your arms around fixing it.
But it's interesting because there's an active and a passive side of dysfunction, whether that's corporately or whether that's personally. And the active dysfunction is, the national allocation is sending snowblowers to bloody Miami constantly. But the passive side is that eventually the other side goes, there's no point, don't bother. Don't bother phoning them because they don't do anything anyway. Exactly. So that becomes the acceptance of dysfunction.
Correct.
And that's where the system for me falls down. Because it's interesting because you're talking about engagement, but this is a great metaphor, a great example, really, not even a metaphor, of how an organization forces disengagement. Because if I don't respond,
correct,
why would you bother?
Correct.
So what's the number one thing for getting that door actually, because you and I have been around a long time in this business, but we've all heard open door policy, and it's a bunch of, we'll call it belief system. That's what it rhymes, the initials are. It's a bunch of crap, right? Open door policy means, open door, come on in, and I'll ignore everything you're saying. So how do we get past that, Steve? How do we get the organization to go, what aren't we seeing? Because we're all blind, we're all subjective, trying to see an objective, and it's not possible. So how do we get the door open?
So I think it's a couple of things. It's sort of like a good analogy is if you weigh more than you should, and you've tried several times to lose weight, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Someone can't tell you you're fat. You have to really decide for yourself that you want to change.
Right.
And you have to begin, sort of charity begins at home. You have to decide you want to do something differently. Mm-hmm. And so, like most things in large organizations, I believe everything starts at the top. So to me, it's incumbent upon the leader, the CEO, the president, whoever it is, depending upon the size of the company, to first come to a threshold decision that I want to behave differently. I need to behave differently.
Right.
If you don't cross that threshold, then you're just going through the motions. So I think part of the issue is you have to come to that realization that business as usual isn't going to work.
But how do you get them to that point? You know, you and I both work with these organizations. We work with these leaders. And I know what I bang up against, and I'm sure you bang up a lot at the same things. How do you get them to, you know, because there's this mentality, especially at the upper echelons of business, which is, this is the way we do it, and we're clearly successful, so don't tell us. Well, you know, my answer to that is you knew how to do it. And what you've done was wonderful, it was successful, but that's a recipe for failure moving forward because everything in the world, and particularly in business and leadership, has transformed. How do you get them to wake up and go, my behavior has got to change, when they're holding on to the egoic sense of what I'm doing has worked. I'm an asshole, but it works.
Right. So what I've been doing lately, and it seems to be more effective than other things, is to use examples of fairly immediate, fairly recent disruption. Mm-hmm. So you start talking about Uber.
Yeah.
And you say things. So I live in New York City, where the taxis have medallions, which 2 years ago were worth $1.6 million each. They were very, very valuable. And there are certain banks whose whole business is financing these medallions for owners.
Yeah.
Today, those medallions are worth about $350,000.
Yeah.
And the answer to the question of why is Uber. Mm-hmm. So 2 years is a very short period of time for a business that's been around over 100 years.
Yeah.
So when you put it in a perspective that dramatic change can happen very quickly and irreversibly, that starts to get people's attention. When you tell people that Airbnb has a market cap that's worth more than Marriott and owns no assets, that also gets their attention. Now, then they say, well, okay, we're in a different business and we got this and we got that.
That's the argument, right? Well, that's not us. We're in a different world.
Well, today in the Wall Street Journal, there was a great article about Intel, which by any stretch of the imagination is an enormously successful company. It actually created the PC market by making the chips.
Yep.
Right? And you know as much about Intel as I do. Well, guess what? They're so successful, they missed out on a few current things. They didn't get involved in the mobile industry. They're not involved in the Internet of Things industry. And they just announced they were firing 12,000 people, which is a lot of people. Yeah, a lot. And they're trying to pivot from PCs and servers to how do they get into the mobile phone business late?
Yes. And
how can they potentially be a leader in this, what's called the Internet of Things? Mm-hmm. They've got enormous brain power. They've got enormous capital. They've got enormous global presence. They're great on quality. They're a fantastic company. But even I don't want to say they fell asleep at the switch, but the more successful you are, you almost get more complacent.
Absolutely.
And that takes off the edge you have that startups have. So one of the things I tell people is I don't care how big you are, you have to start to behave like a startup.
Yes.
Right? And so I try to come at this from several different ways. And normally one of these approaches, I never know which one it's going to be, but it's really to sort of shake people up, shake leaders up. It used to be that, and many books were written about this, that if they're too complacent, create a crisis. Because in a crisis, everybody does what they're supposed to do. Yeah. but it's very short-lived. And then everybody goes back to doing what they were doing before the crisis.
Yeah.
But there's an artificiality of creating a crisis that most smart people see into, and so they don't behave as normally as they would in an actual crisis. So I don't think that works as well anymore. But I think giving people current, meaningful, relevant models that they can see very quickly and say, could that happen to me? Because I don't know any business that's insensitive to other competition. In fact, I had lunch today with somebody. I was talking about a new business I'm talking about with somebody else, and he was telling me about something he's working on. And he says, yeah, we're going to get to this over the next, couple of years. And I said, look, Warren, I said, someone's having lunch somewhere in the world today talking about this very topic, and they're going to do it next month. So if you're going to do it in 2 years, forget it. Don't even waste your time. And he said, you're right. And so there's a complacency, a lethargy that, for whatever reason, consumes very high-powered people and very high-energy people. But there's sort of a feeling that I'm either smarter or better or more powerful, have more money or whatever it is. It's not going to happen to me, and that's wrong.
Well, I think
that's
there's that.
Wrong.
I think when we become very successful in business or as a leader, we reinvigorate that part of us that is the indestructible adolescent.
Right.
So instead of riding a motorbike at 90 miles an hour, or instead of doing stupid shit that endangers your life, you just kind of get very complacent and figure it can't happen to you. And it's one of the questions I too ask is, who's the Uber of your industry? And they go, we don't know. And I go, you better find out. And they say, and I'll go back and I'll say, okay, so what did you find? And sometimes they find somebody, sometimes they don't. And I go, if you haven't found them, how can you be the Uber? That's your next level question. Right. How do you become the Uber? Because you've got to think in a way, and this is one of the things we teach our organizations, is you've got to think in the way of how can I put me out of business? People think about how can I grow my business? That's great. But here's what you need to think about. How can I put me out of business? If you can think from that place, the shift in your thinking is so vast because you get out of complacency. You go, all right, if I was going to put me out of business, how would I do that? Because everything has shifted. And every part of our lives that we thought, well, that'll never change. That will always be the same. It is changing. Right.
So I agree completely with you. And in fact, one of the 5 principles I talk about, I call fresh eyes.
Yes.
It's looking at something from the outside in versus the inside out. So a consultant, for instance, by definition has fresh eyes. They come into a company cold. They don't know any of the stories. They don't know any of the history. They look at data. They talk to, they do all that stuff, and they try to see what's going on. If you were to walk into a company tomorrow as a new CEO, so we hire you, in one of my companies, we hired a CEO who started a month ago. He comes in, we told him stuff during the recruitment process, but he's basically coming in with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
And I told him, look, you better move fast because in about 90 days, you're going to be contaminated like the rest of us, right? It goes away fast. So the question is, it's easy if you're a new guy coming in. It's easier if you're a consultant. But then the question is, well, what if you're the same person who's been there for 12 years as the president or the CEO? How do you get fresh eyes?
Yes.
Because obviously everybody can't just bring in a new CEO, and everybody can't pay a consulting firm millions of dollars a year to do this. So, you got to figure out how to do it yourself. And I tell people, you really have to work hard at it. So, for instance, this sounds almost ridiculous. You leave your office, you walk around the block 3 times, you pretend you've never gone to the company before, and you walk in the front door and you observe everything.
Mm-hmm.
You see that there's a dead tree in the lobby. You see that there are desks without people. You see there are people without desks. You see the phones are ringing and no one's answering them. You see the carpet's tattered. You see crooked pictures on the wall. You see everything. And as you start to learn how to see differently, then you can start to be a little bit more introspective. When you start talking to people at the bottom of the organization, which most leaders don't do, and you ask them, how's it going? What's going on? What's working? What's not working? Believe it or not, they'll tell you because they know. And so you start, it starts with baby steps, but ultimately you start to get some insights that really can tell you things about what you need to know. There's a show, I'm sure you've seen it, called Undercover Boss. Very successful show.
Yeah, I love it.
It's been around for, I think, 10 or 11 years. And when I see it, it makes me crazy. It makes me crazy to think that you have to get dressed up in a wig and a costume to go into your own company and learn how people flip hamburgers and work on an assembly line. And you hear all their personal stories and all their issues and what's wrong with the company and everything. I mean, it's actually staggering. Mm-hmm. One of the guys I interviewed for my book was a very successful CEO. He told me this story that, and he's very personable, and he says he does all of this. One day, he got dressed up as a janitor. He didn't put on a wig or disguise. He just put on the janitor's uniform, and he had the round bin with the wheels, and he had a mop and a broom and everything. And he said people looked at him, and they didn't say hello to him because they didn't think it was him. They thought it was the janitor.
Right.
And he said, and I wasn't wearing a wig, I wasn't wearing a disguise. They just weren't prepared to see me that way. And he said it gave him real insight about what it means to be present and really how people don't see things the right way. So, I have found that taking a fresh eyes approach really starts to, opening your eyes to things that are hiding in plain sight. And really, I think a lot of CEOs, and you've probably seen this too, it's a lot more sexy and fun to talk about strategy, new products, new markets, acquisitions. And that's all good. There's a time and place for that. But somehow you got to be successful doing what you're currently doing. And there's gold there. Sure. But you have to mine it. Yes. But it's easier to let that go its own way and try to find a new shiny object that you're going to spend the next year focusing on. And normally when you do that, I find you actually take your eye off the ball of what's made you successful, which starts actually to deteriorate that business in an unintended consequence way. Yeah. So it's sort of a lose-lose when you do that.
Yeah, of course. What would you say is the main reason, because you're talking about these main piece or the significant steps in creating engagement. What do you believe creates the most disengagement? Because that disengagement is at an all-time high. What do you think creates that in an organization?
I think a lot of it is just habit. I don't think people wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to go to work and be totally disengaged. No. Okay, I don't. We know that, right? But I think it's part of it's sort of a numbing effect. A lot of people tell me they're too busy. When I say, well, why don't you do something like go to a store and see what happens on the floor? Oh, Steve, I'm so busy. I don't even have time to get through my day. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, what are you doing? Well, we're in meetings. Meetings is like cancer. Yeah. And in fact, I have a meetings model in my book. I've created a new way to do meetings that really frees up enormous capacity in the organization. Partly I did that to eliminate an excuse as to why people say they can't be engaged. So I figured, okay, that crutch is gone. You can't say I'm too busy in meetings. I found you 4 hours a day. So what are you going to do with those 4 hours? Right? And they said, well, what should we do? I said, I would get out of my office. Right. Nothing good happens in your office.
So walk us through a little bit about how to change meetings. Because that is, for anyone who's an executive watching this, we all know you have a meeting to plan the next meeting.
Exactly.
So walk us through a little bit about how to shift that with this new model you've got.
So the basic problem of meetings is at some level, it's sort of a food fight. Anybody can call a meeting. Mm-hmm. Anybody can request who should come to the meeting. The default is an hour because that's how much space you have in Outlook for some. So it's already an hour. No materials generally go out in advance. There's no agenda. People do what they do like in church and temple, they read to each other as a group. Why do I have to read to you from a PowerPoint deck? Did you lose your vision? So, and you can go on and on and on. Of course, the meeting ends.
Right.
With 45 minutes to go, you have 3/4 of the presentation to go through. So everybody races. Everybody's packing their stuff up because they've got to go to the next meeting. Mm-hmm. And when the clock hits the hour mark, everybody's out of there. Mm-hmm. Nothing gets decided. And you'll realize you have to have another meeting to continue the conversation. That's sort of the thing. In addition to that, you could have 3 or 4 people from the same department going to a multifunctional meeting. So, and I could go on at this, but, you know.
How do we get them to actually shift out of that mode?
Right. So I created a thing, and it actually works. It's painful, like a lot of good things, but it works. I created this notion called a meeting czar. The meeting czar is in charge of meetings, but it's not a full-time job because no one in their right mind would take that job. You couldn't pay someone enough to do this job. So imagine a leadership team of about 10 people. The meeting czar does that job for 2 weeks, and then it rotates.
Right.
So what does the meeting czar do? 1, any request for a meeting has to go to him or her. And there's a procedure by which she determines, does this require a meeting?
Right.
If the answer is yes, she decides who should be there. And the idea is to keep it skinny. So if you're the CFO, you don't need the controller and 3 of your people. One of you can go, and you can brief your people when you get back. Okay. Right. 3, you have to have a 1-page brief as to what is the purpose of the meeting. Is it to share information? Is it to make a decision? Is it to, whatever? 4, you have to send out a document in advance of the meeting, which everybody has to read before the meeting, or they can't come. Then you set the time of the meeting based on all of the above, with the objective being either 15 or 30 minutes. There is no 1-hour meetings, okay? And so when you set up the meeting, then you invite those people. This is painful, right? So then you have the meeting, and the only thing that happens is the meeting. Oh, and then on the invite for the meeting, it says, these are the 3 or 4 things we're going to discuss at the meeting. And if a decision is required, it will say, we need to make a decision. Okay, so when everybody shows up for the meeting, there's no chit-chat. How was your weekend? How's the weather? And none of that crap. We start with the meeting, and no one goes through the documents. They just go through the questions that went out of what to do. The czar moderates the discussion and draws it to a conclusion that was prescribed in the document that went out before the meeting. Everything's documented. The meeting ends on time. And if there's another meeting, it has to be resubmitted again. So this is one of the most painful processes I've ever been through. And I've helped some companies do this because it's very hard to do it by yourself. I mean, It's really hard. And someone has to be the asshole to call everybody out, on this stuff. But just think about how much time it saves.
Sure.
Instead of an hour, it's at most a half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of 15 people, it's 5 people.
Right.
Instead of it generating 5 more meetings, it might generate 1 more meeting.
Right.
And of course, what happens, and you know this very well, to go to those meetings, you need to be prepared for those meetings. So there's a whole downstream impact of what happens before and after and during the meeting.
Yes.
All of that gets similarly cut. So you go through this process. So then after 2 weeks, I hand the ball to you.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're the czar for the next 2 weeks.
Otherwise known as meeting Nazi.
Meeting Nazi, exactly. And then by the end of, 2 months or so, you've gone through the whole circle.
Right.
And everybody has realized, A, how insane the process was, B, how effective the new process is, and C, they're enormously appreciative that they have time to do what? To think,
right?
To go visit customers, to go visit employees, to talk about new things they can do, and also have some semblance of a life. And once they get that grooved, and it takes about 2 and 2.5 months, then the job is to push it down to the next level.
Next level. etc.
So, in a large company, this whole process could take 6 months to a year before it fully goes down. But when that happens, I'm not going to say it's like the pit crew of a NASCAR race, where they can change everything in like 90 seconds. But it's pretty darn close compared to what it was.
Compared to what it was, for sure.
And so doing that, and there's another benefit to this also, which is it really forces the members of the team to really collaborate, because it's your turn next, so you can't just be a jerk about this.
No.
And I think they see a lot of things that they didn't see before. So what it really does, though, it creates enormous capacity. And people down in the organization looking up say, hey, these guys have made a commitment to do something differently, and we're feeling it. We're feeling it. And they feel good about that. Sure. And then they start to be more comfortable volunteering ideas. And, it's sort of the vicious circle, virtuous circle, sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, right? The reason I did that very simply is because I kept hearing from leaders that they can't do any of this other stuff because they have no time, and the reason they had no time was meetings. So I knew I had to attack the meetings.
What would be your sort of number one tip for greater engagement? How do we get our people more engaged?
I think it starts with, I don't know how this happens, because I think what happens, let me back up a second. I think what happens is, as you become more successful, you start believing your own stuff.
Right.
And I've heard people say to me, like, why would I talk to this person? I'm the president of the company. And I say, well, okay, here's one reason. You're paying their salary.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another reason. They're the only person in the company who's talking to your customer.
Mm-hmm.
Who's paying your salary, by the way.
Yes.
Isn't that a good reason to go talk to this person? I know that in my own experience, from large companies, small companies, turnarounds, growth, I would say 75% plus of the great ideas that I've had and the successes I've had have come from talking to people at the lower ends of the organization.
Yes.
And having them tell me what we should be doing. They know, because they're talking to people every day. You just need to employ the power that's there. And what I say to people is, if you actually do that, you'll be astounded. In fact, with one CEO that I did some work with, I said, all right, let's do this. Let's have a couple of your employees from a call center come to a meeting. And he said, oh, we'll have them up here to the executive conference room. I said, no. We're going to go to the call center, which is about a mile away, and we'll go to them.
Yes.
Right? I said, have you ever been there? He goes, no. I said, I figured as much. So we go there. And, he was so uncomfortable walking into this 1,000-person call center, which is just, 1,000 cubicles.
Yep.
And they're on the phone, so there's this cacophony of sound.
Yeah.
And they're not great jobs. You're on the phone all day, and he's walking into this place like, who are these people? It was obviously a tremendous disconnect. And, so when we actually started to talk to them and saying, like, what are our customers saying?
Mm-hmm.
What are the 3 things you would do differently? And they had 10. He was astounded,
yes.
And it was like an epiphany for him. And I'm thinking to myself, dude, you're 50 years old. You're very successful. You make a lot of money. It never occurred to you to do this? And, and the answer in his case was no.
Right.
I think part of it was he felt that other people were doing it. The manager of that center, the director of the center, the vice president, the senior vice president, the group executive. He probably assumed that they were doing it and they were very talented, so why does he need to do it? But boy, that's wrong.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't mean you don't trust the other people.
No, not at all. But again, the rule of engagement has to start with the willingness to actually engage.
Right.
Like, you're not engaged if you're a mile away and you don't ever go. And sometimes that mile is a wall, but you never get past that. And I love what you said about not having them come here, we'll go there. Because you talked about his discomfort walking into that place. Now times that by 1,000 as a call center person walks into the executive office. You're not going to get the truth in that environment. Never in a million years. Because I'm walking in here, I could be fired. No, I'm not going to get the truth. So, yeah, I think that's a powerful piece. One of the things you talk about in the book is about decision making. Tell us about decision making. What are we going to learn from reading this book about decision making? Because, of course, there are many books on decision making and many strategies for making great decisions. But due to our previous conversation, I know that you come at this a little bit of a different way.
I think people are, they don't want to make mistakes. I've coined this term, playing not to lose.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're in the middle of the Olympics, right? Yeah. And it's very exciting. I love the Olympics for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons I love the Olympics is the only thing that matters to these guys is winning the gold medal.
Right.
They don't want to win the silver medal. If they do, it's okay, but they went to Rio to get the gold.
Yep.
Right? Or they're going to die trying.
Mm-hmm.
So you trained 4 years or more, but you trained 4 years for the Olympics.
Yeah.
And let's face it, only one person wins the gold, right? Yeah. So compare that to business, right? How many CEOs are playing to win the gold medal? Or are they playing to not lose their jobs? Now, I don't mean in a sinister way, but what I mean is if you are a CEO of a public company and you're growing 6-7% a year, the stock's up, things are generally good, you're not appearing on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the board's happy with you, you're getting paid a lot of money, you got one eye on the future, you got one eye on your retirement package. The last thing you want to do is do something so bold that if it blows up, you could get fired.
Right.
Right? And I think I don't think people do this as clearly as I'm describing. I don't think it's sinister where people say this the way I'm saying it to you.
I think it's mostly very unconscious.
It's very unconscious, but it's very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
So the consequence of that is you make smaller decisions that are not bold, that are more incremental in nature. It's more like to keep the ball going back and forth over the net, mm-hmm. as opposed to going for a kill shot.
Right.
And if you look at tennis or ping pong or any of these Olympic sports or volleyball, they're going for the corners. They're going for the lines. They're not going for the center because they want to win.
Yes.
They don't want to just stay on the court for 20 hours. They're tired. So if you think about what the metaphor is for business, they're trying to stay on the court as long as they can. So as it relates to decision making, what does that mean? It means you keep asking for more information. You keep ordering up more analyses. You keep having more meetings. And so in large companies, decisions are made in months, quarters, and years. I was in a meeting in April where we came up with, I'm not taking credit, we came up with an amazing idea for a new business. The CEO said, "That is a fantastic idea, Steve. We'll bake that into next year's plan," meaning we'll start funding it and think about it in 2017. And I said to him, "Dude, someone's going to be in the market by then. We got to start tomorrow." He says, "Well, it's not, I said, "Well, find the money, cut something else out." It's a mentality that it's so prescriptive and so well defined and so organized and routinized. There are metrics, there are KPIs, bonuses are based on it, and the notion of upsetting that apple cart is anathema to the way they behave. So I basically say, hey, that's what Uber's doing.
Right.
That's what the guy who's the Uber of your business is doing. He's not waiting till Q1 to start thinking about it.
No.
Right? So I'm trying to sort of jolt people out of their comfort zone. And your question of why don't they do it, I think it's a lot of fear about making a mistake. It's fear about being wrong. It's fear of stopping something they're currently doing, which may not ever be that much, but at least we can count on it. I heard a retailer talking about a store that by no means should still be in business, and he said, well, they're covering their overhead. So it's not a drain, was his point.
Right.
On cash. I said, well, if you could take whatever that's worth, $10 million, and redeploy it where you could multiply that into 100, would that be a better use of that capital? And of course, the only answer to that question is yes.
Of course.
So why don't you do it? Well, you know why they don't do it. So it's sort of it's a complacency, I think, is what puts people, and again, it's subconscious.
What do you want, if you had to nail it down to one thing, what do you want the one thing the people who read your book to walk away and get? They're just like, this, more than anything, I want you to have this message. What would it be?
I think that if they were to open their eyes and look at their company in a very different way, I would make them a promise. They would find at least one thing they could do very differently that would substantially change the trajectory of the company.
Yeah. Open your eyes. It's a good one. What would you say is your most core belief about leadership? What is at the center of leadership for you?
I think a lot of it has to do with understanding humanity. I read a book 6 months ago. I'm blanking out on the title, but it had to do with military people. And the gist of the title was Officers Eat Last.
Yeah, leaders eat last.
Leaders eat last,
yeah.
Thank you. And
Simon Sinek.
Yes, exactly, thank you. And, that's very interesting. Here you have the lowest level in the Army, and the lieutenant is going to let them eat first, even if that means there's no food left for him. That, to me, is a way of thinking about leadership, that if you want these people to follow you, you have to lead. And part of the way you lead is by showing them not only that you care about them, but how important they are to you in the overall mission.
Yes.
Because when that happens, they will follow you. You can't demand people lead. A leader can't demand that you follow me. You have to earn that.
Yes.
And part of the way you earn that is to convince people by what you do, not what you say, that you're committed, that you're interested, that you care, that you're tough, that you're fair.
Right.
And a combination of all of those, that you communicate clearly, even if it's bad news. All of those ingredients go into what makes a successful leader. And of course, the opposite of that is not. And how do you motivate an organization when they believe that their leader is not effective? It's really difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
And you shouldn't expect great things to happen when you have a leader that's really not leading effectively.
So, Stephen, this has been great. Please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you, find out about the book, potentially maybe bringing you in or how to work with you. How would people reach out to you, and where can they find all the great resources that you have?
Thank you. Well, the best way to do this is to go onto my website, StephenDGoldstein.com. It's got a lot of interesting information. It talks about the principles, a lot of articles, tapes, where you can hear more about this. You can buy my book through the website on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, which is available for sale now.
Fabulous.
And also my email is on there if you would like to contact me to speak to your organization or just to shoot me an email about talking about something. I get a lot of them, and I reply within 24 hours because speed is also very important.
Fantastic. So StephenDGoldstein.com. We'll make sure that we put those URLs up on the pages too so that people can find them. I want to thank you for joining us here today. It's been really great. I want you to stick around. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and you and I will come back together. So thank you for everything that you shared today. It's been awesome having you here. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. It was awesome being on the show.
Terrific. And to you, dear listener, as always, please don't listen to this show. Don't watch this show, but rather use the information you got here. Listen to it twice, take notes, do whatever it is you take. And listen, if you really got something out of this, feel free to reach out to Stephen. You know, he's taken the time to give you here, to give you the most you possibly can get out of this. Take the time to give that back. Have some reciprocity. Reach out. Be generous. And tell Stephen what you got out of the show and how it's going to impact you. And if you are really serious about embracing the kind of positive disruption that builds a culture that develops the next generation of leaders into not only who they need to be, but who they want to be, while becoming evangelical about your organization and generating 10x engagement and productivity, reach out to me through fullmontyleadership.com. fullmontyleadership.com. And remember, I have a gift for you. Right now, it's in beta, so you get it absolutely free. It's $197, but you get it free, and that is the Matrix of Authentic Leadership. You can get that by going Matrix, like the movie, matrix.fullmontyleadership.com, and you can go in there and find out about the 5 categories of authentic leadership and actually find out for yourself, assess for yourself how well you're doing and where your great strengths are and how to really tap into those strengths. I want to thank you for joining us here on Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty interview series. Again, I'm your host, Dov Barron. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everyone that you know. And remember, as always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please go over to iTunes, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And until next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you can open your eyes and see what you haven't been seeing. Till next time, Dov Barron.